Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Moore. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, here in Prague, Czech Republic, on the 22nd day of July, 2017. It's really a pleasure to be here. We'll start from the beginning. 51 years ago, young John Moore, 19 years old, knew that he was headed for the Army and headed for Vietnam. So he enlisted for the option of going into military intelligence. I graduated from military intelligence school, went to Vietnam where I worked in psychological warfare for a year, came back to the States, was in Special Forces the last year of my Army career, active duty, left the Army and became a paralegal. So that's twice that I had formal education to train and discipline my brain to basically become a research tool. After becoming a paralegal, it was only 8 or 10 months later, I was recruited to become a private detective. I was only doing that 3 or 4 months when I was recruited once again to become a criminal defense investigator at the age of 25. I investigated my first homicide at the age of 25 in the fall of 1973, a double homicide. I spent most of my adult life investigating crimes, homicides, burglaries, rapes, armed robberies, and so forth, as a criminal defense investigator. A lot of civil investigations also along the way. 17 years ago, the year 2000, I was working my dream job. Many of you have probably seen the film The Great Escape, starring Steve McQueen. That movie was based on a book written by the man I was working for, Mr. Charles Shaw, who was captured and escaped from German POW camps 5 times during World War II. It was a good life at the time. I had always one murder case in my inventory of cases, a number of other criminal cases. The late winter, early spring of 2000, 2 friends of mine approached me separately. One didn't know the other was going to do it. And they started telling me about this something called NIBIRU, Planet X, Wormwood, the destroyer. I listened to them patiently, and I thought, well, I didn't say this, but I thought, man, you guys need tinfoil hats really bad. This is crazy stuff. But I knew these men well enough that I should go ahead and check it out. So I talked to a friend of mine who is an outside vendor for the lettered government agencies, U.S. government agencies, and I told him about this. He basically told me I needed a tinfoil hat. He said, John, I'll check it out. I'll get back with you. About 4 weeks later, he got back with me. He says, John, it's exactly what you said it is. The federal government of the United States has known about this since 1979. They've been getting ready for it since 1979. Yes, it is true. That's when I began my personal research in year 2000. I did the thing many of you are interested in Planet X and NIBIRU have been doing for years. I found out about Dr. Emanuel Velikovsky, Zechariah Sitchin. I became friends with my friend Professor James McCanny. And I'm researching and I'm learning a lot. The same things that many people learn. The summer of 2007, something else happened. I was having lunch with a friend who served with the U.S. Navy submarines, and I'm telling him about NIBIRU and Planet X, and he starts telling me about a classified briefing he attended in the U.S. Navy in 1985. At that briefing, he was told the following: gentlemen, during your lifetimes, these oceans will come out of their banks, flooding all coastal areas worldwide. And when it comes time to retire from the U.S. Navy, you just might want to retire in the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks, in the center of the United States, as one of the known safe havens, which many thousands of Navy veterans, especially submarine veterans, have done. There's something called synchronicity, and synchronicity started kicking in a matter of weeks. It was only 3 or 4 weeks after that meeting that I was invited to speak to a college group in Rolla, Missouri. My friend, the college professor, was teaching a class on international relations. He asked me to come and speak to the group on terrorism, and I agreed to do so. He didn't tell me there would be a second presenter there. The other presenter was a retired intelligence officer from one of the U.S. Armed Forces. And we did our presentation. We finished and went to a pizza parlor in Rolla, Missouri, and we're talking. I'm sitting here, it's a four-top table, his wife's next to me, the intelligence officer's here, my friend, the college professor, sitting over here. During our conversation, I found out he did a 3-year tour of duty with the Navy Submarine Corps. Well, then I knew I had to ask the question. I never met this man before in my life. I may never see him again. I asked him the question, tell me what you know about rising ocean levels. Before he can speak up, his wife sitting next to me says the following. She says, John, we're at our last duty station at the Pentagon. We're getting ready to retire. We need to pick a place to retire. We picked the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks as our retirement home. I immediately made an appointment to meet him at a restaurant the following week and start making the second revisions. My friend I met with 4 weeks before started making the original Navy map. This gentleman helped me make the second revisions. Synchronicity again. It was only 3 or 4 more weeks. I was teaching a Missouri concealed carry class where people get training to carry pistols concealed. And I asked my students if anybody was a veteran. One man raised his hand. He was a veteran of the United States Navy Submarine Corps. I made an appointment with him the following week. I said, Steve, I can tell his name because he's now deceased. Many submarine veterans get way too much radiation and are always getting cancer. I said, Steve, tell me what you know about rising ocean levels. He says, John, I've been out of the Navy 3 years. I signed a 5-year non-disclose agreement. If I tell you what I know, I could lose my pension. Okay, Steve. Can you blink your eyes once for yes and twice for no? And he smiled and laughed, and we went ahead in our conversations. He made the third and final revisions on that map, the map that's on my DVD, Global Warming, What the Government Isn't Telling You. Is it going to be on the screen? I hope. Everything's at my website, by the way. My website is thelibertyman.com. That's thelibertyman.com. It wasn't long after those interviews that I made the first disc that's on my 2 DVD set. And we posted that image of that map on that DVD. I took delivery of the first run of those DVDs, and I was at a fundraiser. We had a client charged with first-degree murder. It was a cold case that happened 25 years before. And it was being sponsored by the Western Cherokee Nation, American Indians, because our client was Cherokee. So it's a beautiful late summer, early fall day, beautiful weather, live music, great food, everybody's having a good time. I see a gentleman walking around with this official-looking ID badge. It says, Tim Spencer, Director, Emergency Preparedness, Western Cherokee Nation. So I strike up a conversation with him. And we're talking about a lot of things, mostly to do with preparedness and safety and all those related topics. And I decided I would give him a copy of my DVD. So he takes it. He calls me up a week later. And I barely know this man. We've since become very close friends. He's now become my webmaster and co-host with me on my radio show. He calls me up a week later and says, John, I watched your DVD. I said, okay. John, I've seen that map before. Now, I didn't know at the time that he was a veteran of the U.S. Navy Submarine Corps. He says, John, I was in New Orleans. I was doing classified work for the Navy. I walked across the hall to get a cup of coffee. And there's that map on the wall. Your map is on the wall. So he talks to a Master Chief. A Master Chief at that time would have been old enough to be his father. Tim Spencer would have been 21, 22 years old. The Master Chief was probably 43, 45 years old, somewhere in there. Master Chief, what is this map? The Master Chief says, young sailor, all you need to know is the white areas. The white areas are the safe areas. When you retire from the Navy, you want to live in the white area. That's the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks. Now, at the time, Tim Spencer wasn't told why there was a designated white area and what those other markings on the map meant. He was just told that was a safe area. His assumption was there was going to be a nuclear attack on the United States, and that would be a safe area. It was many decades later when he found out the real reason. It was maybe 6 or 8 months later. Tim Spencer is a student of mine in my concealed carry class, along with his wife, Laurie. And we're having lunch, and we're talking about different things, and Laurie says the following. Now, Laurie and Tim are both from Central Florida. Laurie says, John, I don't like cold weather, I don't like snow, I don't like Missouri, but we're here because of that darn map. When Tim Spencer left the Navy, he moved to the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks because of the map. I had a man call me up late winter, early spring of 2009. He had bought my DVD. He watched it. He was living in Montana. And he told me the following. He says, John, I watched your DVD. I said, okay. He says, John, I've seen that map before. I said, really? He says, yeah, really. This is important. He says, it was 1979. I was a young sailor stationed in New Orleans. I got the assignment to set up a briefing room, the chairs, the lights, the sound system. And there was this map on the wall. It had these strange markings on it. It was your map, John. He says, I wasn't allowed to be in the briefing room. It was a Saturday morning briefing for admirals, flag rank officers. He says, John, admirals don't do Saturday morning briefings. So these men show up, they're smoking cigars, telling jokes. How's the wife? How's the family? And they go in the briefing room, which had a closed door guarded by an officer. They don't guard doors with officers. It's almost always a Master Chief. When they came out of the briefing, no more joking, no more cigar smoking. They all looked like their puppy dogs had just died. Very morose. 1979 was also the year, the best I can tell, that the Pioneer 10 space probe found NIBIRU, Planet X. Now, most of astronomy is not looking at stars. Most of astronomy is mathematics. Yes, they do look at stars and they take lots of photographs. But most of astronomy is mathematics. And they've known since about 1900, 1908, somewhere along in there, that something very far out in space, very big, was causing these planets to perturbate when they got to a certain point. They would do that wobble, that perturbation. So they did their mathematical calculations. They knew if they went out in a certain direction far enough, they would find what was causing that. And they did. 1979. They've been tracking it ever since. When people hear a lecture like this, they want to hear about credentials. I'm not a scientist. I played football in high school. I'm no scientist. I'm a homicide detective. But I'm a pretty smart guy, and I've met some interesting people, and I found some interesting information. And then when it comes to looking at stars, let's talk about some credentials. Dr. Robert Harrington. Dr. Harrington was the supervising astronomer of the United States Naval Observatory. Now, if you're going to draw a paycheck for looking at stars, is there any more upward mobility once you've become the supervising astronomer of the United States Naval Observatory? Where else can your career go? Write books, make lectures? I mean, I don't know. Dr. Harrington was interviewed by Zecharia Sitchin in his office at the United States Naval Observatory. What's publicly available is a 10-minute clip from a 1-hour interview. I've talked to the producer. They said that since Mr. Sitchin died, there's family squabbles over the money in the estate and the copyright, who owns copyright to the full hour, which we may never see. The 10 minutes, however, appears on a DVD titled, Are We Alone in the Universe? Are We Alone in the Universe? That's the title of the DVD. So here's Dr. Harrington in his office at the United States Naval Observatory. Here's Zecharia Sitchin. Dr. Harrington confirms Zecharia Sitchin's work. He says, here's the orbit of the 10th planet, Nibiru, very close to the orbit that you found, Mr. Sitchin, in your studies. He describes its size, 5 to 7 times the size of Earth. He says it has a very large iron-nickel core, which gives it more effect as far as gravity and electromagnetic energy. That's what we call in my business as a homicide detective, smoking gun evidence. When I found that interview, I thought, man, I really got something now. It's very important, very important. There's different directions that this research has taken me. Things I found out that appear to be related. One thing I ask my audience frequently is, anybody seen Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, the entire thing? Most people won't admit to watching the whole thing. Some people will say, I watched some of it. Some people say, I never watched it. Al Gore's documentary has some science and some science fiction in it. Now, he does say that there will be violent rising of the ocean levels. He also says it'll be the middle of the century, which would be more or less 2050. That's a science fiction. It's going to be a lot sooner than that. Of course, another part of the science fiction is human activity affecting climate. That can't happen. One good-sized volcano in one day puts more of these so-called greenhouse gases in the atmosphere than all the human beings on Earth in 1 year. Just one good-sized volcano. That's a fiction. But it's part of the, what I call disinformation, to distract and obfuscate and get people to not pay attention to what's really going on. And they've been quite successful. There may be 1.5% of the adults on this planet, and that's pretty optimistic, that understand the real deal. Most people believe either that climate change is a consequence of human activity, or climate change is a natural, slow-moving process that we can't do anything about anyway. That's what most people believe most of the time. Reality is, violent climate change is already here. There's a paper I'm going to mention, and I'm going to say it twice for the benefit of our interpreters here. It's a real catchy title. There's a free download on my website at thelibertyman.com. Paid for with American tax dollars. Here's the title, twice slowly. An abrupt climate change scenario and its implications for United States national security. Like I say, real catchy, right? An abrupt climate change scenario and its implications for United States national security. Oh, they got it up there. Good. Thank you. 21 pages. Published in 2003. 2 researchers were hired by the United States Department of Defense to research and publish what would happen if 2 possible future scenarios took place. The first scenario, the Gulf Stream slowing down dramatically, and the consequences of that. The second scenario, the Gulf Stream stopping completely, and the consequences of that. Ladies and gentlemen, once you hear what I'm about to tell you, you will find this to be 21 of the scariest pages you will ever read in your life, for the following reason. Now, in 2004, the paper was published in 2003. I first found it in 2004. We already knew in 2004 that the Gulf Stream had lost about half of its mass and velocity, give or take. The scientists at the time were believing that it would be maybe 20, 25 years in the future that the Gulf Stream would stop completely. It might be a good time to talk about what is the Gulf Stream. The scientists call the Gulf Stream, it's a mouthful for our interpreters once again, the North Atlantic Thermohaline Conveyor. The North Atlantic Thermohaline Conveyor. Benjamin Franklin gave it the name the Gulf Stream a couple of hundred years ago. Warm water that comes out of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean goes up the east coast of Florida, past Georgia, past South Carolina, gets to about Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, where it starts going, I'll do the opposite map, east by northeast towards England. And it did so for we don't know how many centuries, up until June 12, 2010. Now you want evidence? I know people here want evidence. And my entire adult life has been in the world of evidence. Here's the evidence. The United States Navy, every 24 hours, publishes a brand new map showing ocean surface temperatures. There's a link on my website to the U.S. Navy website. There'll be a warning that comes up, warning, warning, don't go here, your computer's going to explode, don't worry about it, it's not going to hurt your computer. Now they show the ocean surface temperatures in colors. Reds and yellows are warm, blues and dark blues and purples are cold. And you can see the Gulf Stream coming up the east coast of Florida, past Georgia, South Carolina, gets to Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, and it starts going towards the British Isles, which it does for 200 or 300 miles, does a little loop-to-loop, and it's over. No more Gulf Stream. I was introduced to Dr. Luigi Zangari, a PhD scientist living and working in Italy, in July of 2010. And once again, on my website at thelibertyman.com, we have 2 radio interviews. The third Friday and fourth Friday of July 2010, 1 hour each. The first interview, Dr. Zangari said the following: we believe the Gulf Stream stopped last month. We're not sure. We need to recheck our calculations. The following week, he verified, yes, in fact, the Gulf Stream stopped June 12, 2010. So what does this mean? We also found out something else. This was news to me. The Gulf Stream used to, past tense, the Gulf Stream used to regulate the jet stream. No matter where you are on Earth, 5 miles above your head is wind going 150, 200 miles an hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's 3 jet streams: Northern Hemisphere, Equatorial, and Southern Hemisphere. The Gulf Stream used to regulate the jet stream, causing the jet stream to behave in a more or less predictable fashion. The jet stream has a tremendous amount of effect on our weather, especially precipitation and temperature. Now, I've interviewed and debriefed a number of men and women involved in growing grains in North America: wheat, corn, rice, soybeans, spelt, oats, all those grains. Every business has a business model. The business model for growing grains is one bad harvest, hurry 4 good ones. That's the business model for growing grains. Everything these grain growers do, the farmland they buy and lease, the equipment they buy and lease, the seed, fertilizer, pesticides, herbicide, the debt that they carry, everything they do is based on being able to service that debt and expecting one bad harvest for every 4 good ones. That cycle's broken. That cycle is over. Weather has become so erratic they can't count on very much at all as far as dependability of weather. Which means If a farmer doesn't own their land outright, doesn't own their $750,000 to $1 million worth of equipment outright, doesn't have a good stock of seed, they can be in trouble real quick. A lot of farmers are going out of business because of that. A lot of people are focused on, John, when's NIBIRU going to be here? That's understandable. In fact, 17 years ago, when I first found out about this, I made an appointment at a private observatory. I'm going to look and see this thing for myself. I'm going to look and find this thing. What do I know? It's in this, you can only see it from the southern hemisphere, and even then, only in the infrared light spectrum. What's happening with the Gulf Stream is a consequence of the following. We were having a discussion at breakfast this morning briefly. First of all, salt water behaves differently than fresh water. Now, if you take a tank, I'll see if I can do this in meters, 3 meters by 3 meters by 100 meters. With salt water, that's maybe 50 degrees at the same salinity of the ocean, normal ocean salinity. If you inject under pressure a 4-inch volume of water at 75 degrees Fahrenheit, centigrade Fahrenheit thing, you have to excuse me, I don't have that figured out. That 4-inch blast of water will go all the way through that 100 meters intact because it develops a thermal barrier around it. If you start introducing fresh water into that tank, the ability of that thermal barrier to function gradually breaks down until it doesn't function at all. That's why the Gulf Stream broke, is because of reduced salinity in these oceans. A consequence of melting freshwater ice in Greenland, melting freshwater ice in the Antarctic. Now, the melting ice at the Arctic is floating seawater, so that doesn't change either the ocean levels or the salinity, either one. Doesn't matter. You may have seen recently in the news the massive ice shelf that broke off the Antarctic. And mainstream news reports on how much the sea level is going to rise, which would be maybe 1 or 2 inches. Big so what? What they don't talk about is a reduction of salinity of the oceans. That's what they're not talking about. That's what's very important. Now, the North Atlantic thermohaline conveyor, the Gulf Stream, is only one of many ocean currents. Atlantic Ocean, North Atlantic, South Atlantic, Pacific, and so forth. Many ocean currents. And they're all being affected and all being disrupted by the reduced salinity of these oceans. Very important because it's changing our weather in very dramatic fashion. I want to talk a little bit about Immanuel Velikovsky. Now, at the end of my 2 DVD set, there's a bibliography with more than a dozen books. A 2 DVD set is 4 hours of lecture. What I'm doing is very abbreviated. The 4 hours is very abbreviated. Dr. Velikovsky was a medical doctor. He was not an archaeologist, but that was his hobby. That's what he loved to do. And he traveled around the planet to observe and find places where cataclysmic events had left evidence. Caves that had the jumbled bones of saber-toothed tigers and monkeys and elephants all jammed together as if they all died at the same time. One of the things Dr. Velikovsky did that no archaeologist had taken the time to do before was compare and correct the ancient calendars so that you could match up events. The ancient Chinese calendar, the South American calendar of the Mayans, Northern Europeans, the Egyptians, the Israelis. You can't line up events until and unless you line up calendars. Most of us know that when Moses was leaving Egypt, that the Nile River turned red. We know because of the Hebrew calendar when that happened. We also know because of Dr. Velikovsky that the calendar in China recorded the same event at the same time, the water in China turning red. We know because Dr. Velikovsky's work that the Mayans recorded their waters turning red, and the Northern Europeans the same thing. All the water on the planet turned red at the same time. Probably iron oxide, probably part of NIBIRU. Very important work. Dr. Velikovsky was hammered mercilessly, made fun of, marginalized. Everything the mainstream media and the powers that be could do to make sure people didn't pay attention to Dr. Velikovsky. Well, his work is still available, and I encourage people to read his work. It's very foundational. Zecharia Sitchin. And you take one look at Zecharia Sitchin and you say, yeah, there's a guy who spent 40 years in a library. I mean, he's got that scholarly look about him. He could pick up Babylonian and clay tablets and read them like we read the newspaper. Quite a talent. And it's very critical that he and Dr. Harrington got together for that interview. I'm so glad that happened, and they made a record. Dr. Harrington, not long after that interview, which was in the late 1980s, he announced publicly he was packing up equipment, and he's going to go to the Antarctic and see this thing for himself, which he did. He packed up his equipment, he went to the Antarctic, and 3 or 4 months later, he was dead from cancer. And when you see Dr. Harrington, he looks like he could be a former football player, a big, vigorous, tough guy. Pocket protector, thick eyeglasses, but a big, tough guy, healthy guy. Dead from cancer in 3 or 4 months. A lot of speculation about that, but there's no evidence to back up any of the speculation about the circumstances of his death. His research assistant, shortly after Dr. Harrington's death, said, I don't believe in Planet X or NIBIRU. I'm not going to do any more work in that area. He got the memo. He got the memo. The main focus and message I want to get to everybody watching this, and I was talking to one of the young ladies earlier, when I'm interviewed on a radio show or I got a journalist that wants to talk to me, they want a 2-paragraph response, a 2-paragraph answer to something that is incredibly complex. You can't properly respond. You cannot understand this matter in 2 paragraphs or 100 paragraphs or 100 pages. It takes a lot of diligence, a lot of research. Research from verifiable sources. Now, when the Department of Defense publishes a paper that they paid for, that's pretty good evidence. This is not something generated by somebody in their home. A real document, really paid for with American tax dollars. When you go to the U.S. Navy website and you see that map every 24 hours, that's real evidence. I'm a film buff, and there's some Hollywood films that have given us some messages. One is titled The Day After Tomorrow. The main premise of The Day After Tomorrow is the consequences of the Gulf Stream stopping. That's it. That's the main premise. Now, they allude to human activity causing violent climate change, which of course is silliness. At the beginning of the movie, near the beginning, there's 3 scientists on an island off the coast of Scotland, and their job, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, is to monitor the buoys out in the North Atlantic that monitor and report back ocean surface temperatures. Now, because it's Hollywood, they show the consequences of the Gulf Stream stopping in just a matter of weeks, when in reality it takes years. But it's Hollywood and it's very dramatic. So these scientists are watching these buoys, and one reports a dramatic drop in temperature, then another, and finally, after an hour or so, all the buoys in the North Atlantic are reporting a dramatic drop in temperature. That's when the Gulf Stream stopped, right then. In the film, it's only a matter of weeks before a new ice age begins. Reality is that it's going to take much longer than that. Much longer. This has happened before. If you dig down through the permafrost in Alaska at the Arctic Circle, you find vegetation that it can only exist in tropical areas. That's pretty well known, pretty well understood. This has happened many times before. The topic of pole shifts comes up. When molten lava is coming out of the volcano and is flowing, as it cools down, just before it gets hard and becomes rock once again, the magnetic particles in that lava line up with magnetic north. Wherever magnetic north is, at that moment when that rock cools down and becomes solid, it lines up with magnetic north. So scientists can go back to volcanoes, 500-year-old, 1,000-year-old, 20,000-year-old volcanoes, and they can find out where magnetic north was when that lava cooled down 5,000, 10,000, 50,000 years ago. It doesn't matter. And magnetic north has been in many different places. Many. This is real science and easily verifiable. Most of these pole shifts are generally 12, 15 degrees. It may not sound like much, but it's a lot. The next one, I believe, will be dramatically greater than that, possibly as much as 45 degrees. And that's, a lot of that part of science is what I might call educated speculation. Quite frankly, it is. It's enough to know that it's going to happen, and we do know that it's happened many times in the past. Many times. This one will be a devastating one. Most people on this planet will die. At least 9 out of 10, maybe 95 out of 100. I don't know. Most people on this planet live within, see if I can do kilometers, 100 kilometers of an ocean, 150 kilometers of an ocean. That's that way in the United States. Most people live on the East Coast and the West Coast and the Gulf Coast. The middle of the country where I live doesn't have nearly as many people. These are the areas that will be dramatically affected, devastated underwater. A friend of mine was on a vacation out west, I think in Arizona, and he climbed to the top of one of these mesas. We've all seen the photographs of the mesas in the westerns, these rock formations that are flat on top. He climbed to the top of one of these mesas, and he says, "John, there's seashells all over the top of this darn thing." I said, "Oh, yeah, really?" He says, "Yeah, seashells. Not the fossils of seashells, they were the seashells. Not the fossils, actual seashells." Yes, this has happened before. When you see the Navy map, you'll see the following. Beginning at the Canadian border in Nova Scotia up there, and coming south, we have devastation typically 50 to 100 miles inland. The Navy veterans that I debriefed, they all said that the ocean will be as far inland as the Blue Ridge Parkway. Now, the Blue Ridge Parkway is a road that people like to drive, especially in the fall when the leaves are turning colors. It runs north-south, typically about 100 miles from the ocean. Typically. So coming down the East Coast, you're going to have the homes, the businesses, the hospitals, everything, where 75, 80 million people live, basically wiped out. Going down the coast, you've got South Carolina, Georgia, Florida. Florida's going to be gone. There will be no more Florida. Which brings up something else I'll mention in a moment, which is fascinating. The Gulf Coast, about half of Alabama, a little more than half of Mississippi, almost all Louisiana will be underwater. And Texas, devastation about 80 to 100 miles inland. West Coast, not quite so bad. It gets pretty high elevation pretty quick. There's an inland sea, what's going to become an inland sea. So the problem with California is that's where all the people live, is on the coast. What do we have in Los Angeles? 15, 20 million people? They'll be gone. And you got Washington State and Oregon. The middle of the country, the Mississippi River, will split the country in two. The Mississippi River will be 100 to 200 miles wide, a couple hundred feet deep. The government's already planning for this. The main new capital will be Denver. Talk about that a little bit more. The eastern capital and the minor capital would be Atlanta, Georgia, the highest elevation major city east of the Mississippi. The government is already splitting, like, for example, the U.S. Army. The United States Army NORTHCOM, Northern Command, is being split east-west of the Mississippi River. They've been doing that now for 8 or 10 years. There was a project that I'm working with my listeners on my radio show, and I could not possibly do this by myself. And Florida reminded me of it. We're recovering images from movies and television shows and now magazines showing continents with new coastlines. It all began about 3 years ago. One of my listeners found an image on the original Godfather movie, 1972. The Godfather's in the Vatican for a meeting with a high-level Vatican official. He's in a room maybe 1,000 or more years old, 20-foot ceilings, and there was a mural of the world, map of the world, on the wall. And it shows the continents with new coastlines. We didn't think much of it. We posted it on my website. Nothing happened until January of this year, 2017. One of my listeners was watching an American television show called Highway Patrol, starring Broderick Crawford. 1957, and we got the image on my website. The episode was titled Dead Hunter. And for you youngsters, I'll just give you a little bit of history here. In 1957 in the United States, there were 3 TV networks. Everybody in the United States had their choice of 3 TV shows any given evening. Highway Patrol was the top one in that time slot, black and white. So the homicide detective, Broderick Crawford, is in the office of an oil petroleum executive talking about the murder case. On the wall behind Broderick Crawford is a 3 by 5 foot map of North America with new coastlines. And ladies and gentlemen, if you've seen my map on my DVD, you're looking at it on that image there. Crystal clear and sharp. Broderick Crawford's forehead is right at Portland, Oregon. You can see it takes up the whole screen. Well, that was January 2017. That opened the floodgates, literally. The whole list, and it keeps growing, the whole list is posted at my website at thelibertyman.com. But they generally, they being the powers that be, they pick out the winners. We got Hunger Games. We've got Superman. We've got A Beautiful Mind. We've got Superman Returns. And many others. One of my listeners found an image on Look magazine. Now, Look magazine was a monthly publication, hugely popular in the States for decades. 1952, the Navy map is published. Now, the article was about UFOs, but the map they showed is the Navy map showing Florida gone, new coastlines, inland sea. That one kind of surprised me. I didn't expect to see an image going that far back to 1952, but it's right there. 1955, a children's show called Captain Midnight. The image is on there. I'm encouraging my listeners to find more images of continents with new coastlines, get those images to me, and as a thank you, they get their choice of any of my 5 DVDs. And they just keep coming in and coming in. It's a long list and keeps growing. I believe the term is predictive programming. We heard earlier today about the compulsion of the powers that be to give us a warning, to let us know what's going to happen. And that's what they've been doing. We've verified now since 1952 at least. At this point, I don't even want to speculate how far back in time we may go. 1952 surprised me. 1955 surprised me. There may be earlier ones. I don't know. We'll find out. It's a work in progress. How are we doing on time? Not too bad. I'll be back up here after lunch. We'll take a 10-minute break at noon, by the way. I have a radio show, Monday through Friday. The link to listen to it is at my website at thelibertyman.com. You can listen to the archives. If you listen here live in Europe, it would be late afternoon, I think, right? Late afternoon, 8 a.m. my time. Early evening. Early evening. But the archives are there and you can listen anytime you like. Every Wednesday, the first hour, I interview Professor McCanney. Now, unlike myself, Professor McCanney is a credentialed astrophysicist. He's taught astrophysics at the university level. He's taught mathematics at the university level. He's published one book, mostly dedicated to the topic of NIBIRU and Planet X, and what he calls a 60-page pamphlet, a small book, about surviving the consequences, and I believe about 9 other books at this point in time. Brilliant man, amateur archaeologist. And I encourage people to read all his books, but especially the one on NIBIRU and his little pamphlet on how to survive the consequences of NIBIRU, which we'll be talking more about this afternoon. I know we have doubting Thomases, and I encourage doubting Thomases. I don't want you or expect you to believe what I'm telling you without your own independent research. Here's some things you can do to convince yourself. We all use Google searches these days, right? There were press releases done for the following that you can recover. One is the CIA shutting down part of their operations in Langley, Virginia, and moving to Denver. Now, the original press release said, we want to disrupt the good old boy network that's been in place for so many decades, so we're moving all these people to Denver. Well, even their own people were laughing about that, so they changed it. The new press release said, we're doing it for operational reasons. National Security Agency, no such agency, Fort Meade, Maryland. There was a statement in a movie where they said that there was 19 acres, I believe, they said, of Cray mainframe computers underground at Fort Meade. That was a true statement. Enemy of the state, Gene Hackman. That was a true statement. The press release for moving Fort Meade, NSA, to Denver and to Utah was the following, which if you know about how the American power grid works, it's hilarious. They say the local electric provider, utility, cannot provide us enough electricity that meets our requirements at Fort Meade, so we're moving to Denver. That's hilarious, because electricity is bought and sold back and forth across the 50 states like any other commodity. You need more electricity, just buy it, and it's shipped in from wherever it needs to come in. So that's obviously a cover story, obviously. Do we have any scientists in the audience? Anybody who took chemistry in school? A couple? Okay. Now think about this. It's the end of World War II and you want to set up a place to work on really fun stuff like anthrax, for example. Would it be a smart idea to get maybe a 200-acre island 100 miles off the coast of the United States where it would be safe and you could play around with anthrax and other biological things? That's what they did. Right after World War II, they bought an island called Plum Island. Plum just like the fruit, Plum Island. And you can, once again, using Google Images, you can see an image of Plum Island. It looks like a 200 or 250-acre golf course with 5 buildings on it. The press release says, we ran out of room on Plum Island, so we have to move to the worst place you can imagine. Manhattan, Kansas, in the middle of the most important and productive agricultural real estate on the planet, Manhattan, Kansas. That's where they moved the biological testing facility. And by the way, Plum Island, I think is still for sale if anybody wants to buy it. No takers, right? These are press releases that anybody can find doing their own independent research. I've talked to any number of business people. They may have 10 employees, maybe 100. Let's say you've got 5,000 employees working at Langley, Virginia, and you want to move them to Denver, which is, probably 1,700 miles one way. Before you move the first person, you have to duplicate in Denver everything you've got at Langley, Virginia. The building, the workstations, housing for all these people and their families. An incredibly expensive undertaking, to say the least. But that's what they did. They did it because they have no choice. They did it because they know what's coming. Now, if it was going to happen 30 or 40 years in the future, why would you move people now who are going to be retired 30, 40 years in the future? Does that make any sense? No. You do it when you have no choice. Many people, and I found some who didn't know this, but it's been pretty widespread in the alternative media, even in the mainstream media. I've seen it in the mainstream media. The massive, brand new, shiny, empty cities in China, in the Gobi Desert. Nobody lives there. Not voluntarily. Beautiful, brand new cities that have nobody except custodial caretakers there. How many million people could live in these cities? 10, 30, 40 million. The ones who've been chosen to survive by the Politburo. Who would these people be? The most intelligent, most productive, the most athletic, most handsome, most attractive women to start over. And of course, the sons and daughters of the Politburo, doesn't matter how smart they are, they're going to be there anyway, right? When I ran for the United States Congress in 1996, I remember news reports that the Russians were building underground cities in the Ural Mountains. I was talking to my team and I said, what's this about? The Cold War is over. Why are they spending hundreds of millions of dollars to build underground cities in the Ural Mountains? We didn't know. It didn't make any sense. Now it makes sense. It makes absolute sense. The Vatican Library, and you can find the press releases for this easily. The Vatican Library was closed, I believe, for 3 years, if I'm not mistaken, for a renovation. Now, the Vatican Library had been open every working day for centuries, many centuries. Closed for renovations. Now, we know that. Now it's back open. What we don't know is what the real reason was. I don't necessarily believe that it was closed for renovations. Typically, a library like that, they would close part of it, leave part open as they did their renovations. It is the most important repository of ancient documents on the planet, as far as I can tell. And the Vatican has survived lots of things the past 1,700 years, and they fully intend to survive this also. A friend of mine, he's a radio frequency engineer at a very high level. He was given a contract to set up two-way military-grade radio communications between a Catholic facility in St. Louis, Missouri, and the Vatican. This would have been about 1998. We didn't know about NIBIRU back then, at least I didn't. But now it makes perfect sense why they would do that. There's not going to be any press releases on that, by the way. That's very private. Being an investigator can mean a lot of things. When it comes to investigating homicides, it's basically two things: finding witnesses and taking statements, both of which I'm very good at. In my capacity teaching Missouri concealed carry training so people could get their permits to carry pistols concealed, I've met and debriefed about 24 Navy veterans, men that don't know each other. This is critical. When you interview witnesses who don't know each other, that are basically telling you almost the exact same story, that's very important. It should get your attention. It got my attention. Without exception, these men were all told the following: gentlemen, in your lifetimes, not your children's, not your grandchildren's, gentlemen, in your lifetimes, these oceans are going to come out of their basins, flooding all coastal areas worldwide. Now, they weren't told why. They're sitting in the folding chairs, getting this briefing. They weren't told why it would happen. They were just told that it would happen. There's a group in the United States called the Prophecy Club. They did something with me they'd never done with any other speaker. They sent me on 2 speaking tours in less than a year. The first one had to do with terrorism. The second one had to do with NIBIRU, Wormwood, Planet X. So I'm in Detroit, and we got standing room only in this room. And I'm talking about NIBIRU, and I'm talking about the Navy veterans living in the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks. 3-hour presentation, 2 10-minute breaks. At the end of the first break, a gentleman walks up and introduces himself. He says, "John, I'm in the insurance industry. Myself, my coworkers, we've wondered for years, why is there such a cluster of thousands of Navy veterans in the zip codes, the counties of the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks?" He said, "Now we know. Now we know." That's why I've bumped into so many of these men in these pistol classes, because when they retired, they wanted their families to be safe and move to one of the known safe areas. We'll be talking more about that later this afternoon. What are safe areas? Why are they safe? And what you can do to be safe yourself. And it doesn't apply just to the United States, it applies worldwide. When I was talking to Alexandra about coming here over the past 2 months, she initially asked me what my thoughts were when I first found out about this, and when I determined that, first of all, it was real, and second of all, that the United States government was not going to inform anybody. I told Alexandra I was very angry that our government would do nothing to inform our people, to help them be safe. I was very angry. That was 17 years ago. I've now come to an entirely different conclusion, however. If they had informed people in 1979 or 1980, it wouldn't change much. To create housing, fresh water, have places for people to stay and work in the middle of the country, that couldn't happen in 1979. It can't happen now. It's too much. That infrastructure does not exist and won't exist. Informing people what would happen would only lead to early death and early misery for people who are going to die anyway. That's the conclusion I've come to. That's my reality. In the meantime, I inform as many people as I can personally because it's the right thing to do, knowing full well that it's a small audience. Maybe 1 out of 100, maybe 1 out of 200 will understand this information, incorporate it into their being, and actually do something about it. A very tiny percentage. But I reach out to the ones I can, and they do what they're going to do. I take no responsibility for what they do. That's their choice. There's been lots of rabbit trails along the way this past 17 years, finding out about things I never really looked into before, about space, about planets, about the effects of these planets, ancient archaeology. This old planet that we live on has been through these cycles many times in the past. There's an area of archaeology that's kind of loosely called forbidden archaeology. I've got a nice stack of books about that particular area. And the evidence is not that difficult to find. We recently, I say we, Western civilization, the scientists, the archaeologists, only 6 or 7 years ago found the second tallest man-made building on the planet. It was, up until the hotel in Dubai was built, the tallest building on the planet. The pyramid in Bosnia, the Great Pyramid in Bosnia, I think they call it the Pyramid of the Sun, which as of July 2017 is the second tallest human-built building on the planet. This is only, I believe in 2017, only year number 6, maybe year number 7, that archaeologists have been working there to determine what this thing is, who built it, when it was built, and they still don't know who built it or when it was built. The second tallest building on the planet. If you go to the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, to just the right spot, you'll find hundreds of acres covered with green glass. Well, before August of 1945, we didn't know how you get the heat of the sun at the surface of the planet. We didn't know that. We found out twice in August 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's how the sand in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula turned into glass. We now know that nuclear weapons were not only set off in ancient times in Saudi Arabia, but, for example, Kashmir, that disputed territory between India and Pakistan. I was talking to a friend of mine, a retired petroleum engineer. I know he'd been all over the planet. And I asked him, have you ever been to Kashmir? He says, yes, John. My wife and I went there on vacation. I said, are you aware nuclear devices were set off there 12,000 years ago? He says, oh yeah, John. They sell trinkets in the local souvenir shops commemorating nuclear devices being set off 12,000 years ago in Kashmir. It's common knowledge. And the scientists can go there right now in July of 2017 with the right detection equipment, and they can find the radioactive isotopes in Kashmir. There's other places. Europe has had nuclear devices set off here 12,000 years ago, and other places. Our ancestors, and this whole thing about aliens, I think, is partly a cover-up. Our ancestors had the ability to split the atom 12,000 years ago. That's my reality, and the evidence is right there. If you go through the history books, you'll find a cycle of about every 3,600 years. You go back 3,600 years ago, 7,200 years ago, and so forth. Major civilizations collapsing and new civilizations coming up about every 3,600 years. That's what the evidence shows. Something cataclysmic happens to this planet about every 3,600 years. And we, all of you listening and watching, we're the generation that's going to experience the next one. I'm absolutely convinced of it. The United States government is convinced of it. The Russian government's convinced of it. The Chinese government. You think they built those beautiful new cities in China for work programs? I don't believe so, no. They built them because they need them. They built them because they have no choice. You think the Russian government hollowed out entire mountains to house millions of people as a work program? I don't believe so. They did it because they had no choice. The U.S. government is not taking care of their people. They're not building shelters for the American population. They have built very extensive, very nice shelters for their own people, the military, government officials, but not for the American population. Now, I've heard, and I haven't verified it, that Norway has notified their people to a certain extent. I interviewed a man from Switzerland, and he says, John, it's not quite real common, but somewhat common knowledge in Switzerland about the violently rising ocean levels. So there's a whole subcurrent of people worldwide that know about this, governments that know about this, and are making plans and spending hundreds of millions, billions of dollars to prepare for this event. One of the things I came across in my research was a tribe in Africa called the Dagon people. They have a cave that's got images on the roof of the cave showing our solar system, complete with Pluto that they've had for many, many centuries. We didn't know Pluto existed till about 100 years ago, by the way, 110 years ago. We didn't know Pluto even existed, but it's been on this cave in Africa for many, many centuries. It's part of their religious beliefs to maintain that cave. And they appoint one person for their lifetime to be the guardian of that cave and that knowledge. If there's anything I can get across to the people watching this DVD, this film, is that you need to pay heed. You need to do your own independent research. You need to come to your own conclusions. You can believe that China built massive, brand new, shiny cities for tens of millions of people as a work project, or you can believe they built them because they have no choice. I tend to believe the latter. You can believe that the CIA moved thousands of employees, their families, their furniture, their dogs, 1,700 miles for no good reason, or you can believe they did it because they had no choice. The Denver airport is a fascinating place. I haven't been inside. I've driven past it half a dozen times. I don't really want to go in there. They moved enough dirt there to build a brand new Panama Canal. That's a lot of dirt. Millions of cubic yards, cubic meters of dirt. There's basically an underground city there. There was a film done many years ago called Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Incredibly popular film. They give the coordinates of where the aliens and the human beings are going to meet. The latitude and longitude of where the aliens and the human beings are going to meet. And it really is a real latitude and real longitude. And when I first found out about this, I was incorrect in where that latitude and longitude was. But now that I've looked into it a little deeper, I know the reality of it. When the film was produced, well, first of all, in the film they say that latitude and longitude is Devil's Tower, which is a very popular tourist attraction, I believe in Montana, if I'm not mistaken. It turns out that latitude and longitude is not Devil's Tower. And at the time the movie was being made, there was about 6, maybe 7 possible locations for the new Denver airport. The latitude and longitude is north of Denver and a little bit east, but nowhere near where that Devil's Tower is. I haven't verified it, but I believe that the latitude and longitude that they gave in the film was probably one of the 6 possible locations for the new Denver airport. It certainly was not Devil's Tower. We know that for a fact. Hiding things in plain sight. You may hear that term occasionally, but they do that. They hide things in plain sight. They use cover stories, they use obfuscation, and outright lies, of course. I know in Missouri, I've ran across a couple of these government projects. One was the Weldon Springs Remedial Action Project, very near St. Louis, the next county west. I was training out there. I was in the Army Reserves from 1979 until I think about 1983 or so. I was training out there with Special Forces in 1979 and 80 when the government announced a Superfund cleanup site to clean up nuclear waste. It was about a 2,000-acre area. And in the 1950s, they took about 40 acres, and they were manufacturing nuclear material for the Defense Department. So they announced that they were going to clean that up, and we all thought, that's fine, clean it up. That's a good idea. About a year later, they announced they were closing down the entire military training area for the same reason. Oh, there's my map. Okay. Well, we knew that was a fabrication for the following reason. The men I worked with, many of us were at an age where we would be having children, and we didn't want children with flippers. We wanted children with arms and legs. So we, without telling the Army, without the Army's knowledge or consent, we took our own radiation detection equipment into the training area, and we always did that. We never found anything above normal background radiation, ever. So we knew that when they announced they were shutting down that training area because of nuclear waste, we knew that was a cover story. We knew that was a fabrication. That's when I began my own investigation, taking photographs on the ground, taking photographs from the air, doing Freedom of Information Act requests, which is a formal process to request documents from the government about government activities. And last but not least, debriefing men and women who actually work there, both as outside vendors and employees on the premises. That's where the real information came from. Here's how the government, or one of the ways, I should say, the government keeps secrets. It's by compartmentalization. Now, many of you have heard about the Manhattan Project. That was a project during World War II where the United States was building the first 2 atomic weapons. My father and my grandfather both worked on the Manhattan Project. They were plumbers. There was about 250,000 American men and women who worked on the Manhattan Project. There may have been 100, maybe 200 of those men and women who actually knew what they were doing. The rest of them, like my father, the plumber, my grandfather, the plumber, they didn't have a clue what they were doing because it was all compartmentalized. That's how they keep secrets. I became friends with a woman who was an employee. She was an environmental engineer at the Weldon Springs Remedial Action Project. And she wore a ID badge that had a certain color code on it, which allowed her to go in certain areas of the administration building and prohibited her from going to other areas of the administration building. Now, why would you prohibit your own employees from going into certain areas of your own administration building? Why would you do that? Well, there's only one reason: you're trying to keep a secret. There is no other reason. What they did at Weldon Springs was build an underground command and control center. There was a water tank that could take care of a city of 2,000 people, probably. Massive electric power coming into it. And once again, they moved a lot of dirt and rock. Another friend of mine, in fact, I served with him in Special Forces. He was a surveyor. That was his day job. Green Beret on weekends, surveyor during the week. He said, John, they've had every survey company in Metro St. Louis out here incrementally doing a bit here and a bit there. No survey company knows the entire thing, only bits and pieces. Once again, compartmentalization. We debriefed a ready-mix, a concrete ready-mix driver. They deliver the big trucks with the concrete. He said, John, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've never had an order to place titanium flakes in the concrete before. Why would you do that? Well, to block radio frequency engineering. It wouldn't stop radiation, but it would block radio frequency engineering. Let's look at this map a little bit since it's here. It's pretty much as I describe. Now, my starting point when I did this, I had to have a beginning point. I used Gordon Michael Scallion's map, and he's a fairly well-known psychic. He did his map, probably in the early to mid-1980s. What we discovered with Scallion's map was from the Mississippi River east, it was fairly accurate except for Wisconsin. Without exception, every Navy veteran said Wisconsin's going to be completely underwater. From the Mississippi River west, Scallion's map's not even close. Scallion's map shows the Pacific Ocean going all the way into Nevada and even parts of Utah. This is the real Navy map. Now, I'm going to say about 7 or 8 years ago, somebody published on the internet something called the Navy map. It's not the Navy map. It's basically a version of Scallion's map. And it's been published and published over and over. And anybody who's looked into what Google does and how they do it, they know that Google will obfuscate. A good example of what Google does in obfuscation has to do with something called the Black Knight satellite. Pepsi-Cola, in January of 2016, I believe it was, they did this very slick production. Anybody see it about the Black Knight satellite, Pepsi-Cola? Anybody? Nobody? Okay. It's there. You can see it on YouTube. Up until then, almost nobody had even heard of the Black Knight satellite. It was a big splash in the media. I don't know how many $1 million that Pepsi-Cola spent on this thing, but it had to be expensive. Once again, we get into ancient archaeology, forbidden archaeology, when it comes to the Black Knight satellite and our ancestors. One of the jobs, I should say, back up a bit, archaeology has 2 jobs. One is to recover ancient technology. The other is to keep us from finding out about it. That's it. When the U.S. Army went into Baghdad, where did they go first? The Army headquarters, the government headquarters? They went to the Baghdad Museum. That's where they went first. That's what they wanted, in the basement of the Baghdad Museum. Ancient technology, ancient documents. And they got it, and they brought it all back. It's probably in the basement of the Smithsonian as we speak, being reviewed. The Black Knight satellite. There's an author, he lives in New Zealand, archaeologist, Jonathan Gray. He wrote a book titled Dead Men's Secrets. Dead Men's Secrets, Jonathan Gray. The first page of the first chapter, he talks about the Black Knight satellite. I hadn't heard about this before. Fascinated me. Scientists believe it's about 12,000 years old. It's in orbit on a polar orbit just below the Van Allen radiation belt, about 22,000 miles up. It took me several years to find the third dimension of the Black Knight satellite. I knew it was 40 by 70 feet. I didn't know the third dimension, which is 20 feet, until about 2 or 3 years ago. 40 feet by 70 feet by 20 feet. It has another nickname you don't hear very much publicly. The other nickname is the chirogenic box. Chirogenics, of course, is the study and use of absolute zero. Everything changes at absolute zero, which brings up another whole set of questions about the Black Knight satellite. It was during the Eisenhower administration, the late 1950s. Just to go back a little bit, the first American satellite went up about the size of a big grapefruit. The first, unless I got this backwards, the first Sputnik, I think, was about the size of a basketball. I remember as a little boy walking out into my yard, and I could see this thing going over on an equatorial orbit, by the way. And I sometimes say, if you're a 35-year-old Air Force captain on night watch at the White House, Waking up your five-star general president at 2 o'clock in the morning without a really good reason would not be career enhancing, but that's what they did. They woke up the president. Can you come to the Situation Room, Mr. President? We found something. They found the Black Knight satellite. Now, before those two, the Sputnik and our first satellite went up, there was no radar or optical tracking stations for things in space. They had no reason for them before the Sputnik and our satellite went up. So they had optical and satellite tracking, radar tracking stations set up, and they found the Black Knight satellite on a polar orbit. Now, we couldn't do polar orbits until about 20 years later. We could only do equatorial orbits. They immediately knew that they found something very special. They immediately knew that the technology on there is something they really, really wanted to get their hands on. Oh, that's interesting. It became a matter of highest national security and highest national priority to gain access to what's in that box. Now, I've got as far as a United States senator from one of our southern states who knows the Black Knight satellite exists but doesn't know if we've gained access to it or not. My belief, and I have no evidence to back this up, my belief is the Apollo space missions was a pretext to get their hands on the money and develop the lift capability to get 22,000 miles up to gain access to what's inside the Black Knight satellite. As I know, the Apollo space mission didn't put any Americans on the moon. I know that for a fact. Anybody who believes that needs to do their homework. Have they gained access to the Black Knight satellite? Quite frankly, I don't know. I do know that technology since the mid-1950s has gone forward so incredibly fast. I know there's 3 engineers given credit for developing the first transistor. I have people telling me that it's actually reverse engineered alien technology. I don't know, but it certainly could be. When you start looking at NIBIRU, one of the first things people want to find out if their aunt's home near the ocean is going to be underwater. If their home near the ocean is going to be underwater. That's an understandable thing. It's a very human thing. You want to know if people you care about are going to be safe. There's a lot more to it than that, however. A lot more. A lot of people, Americans, I do private consultations, and I'm certainly willing to do private consultations here in Europe. They look at these maps, at this map, the map that was up there a moment ago, and they say, oh, there's a safe place. The Appalachian Mountains, good high elevation, plenty of rainfall, mild winters. And I agree with them. Great altitude, plenty of water, mild winters. Appalachian Mountains are, well, how can I describe this? You got Tennessee and North Carolina, South Carolina, right down where those states meet. Here's the problem with the Appalachian Mountains. What is this there? Oh, a pointer. Oh, how neat. They're going to make me high-tech anyway. The Appalachian Mountains are right here. And the Blue Ridge Parkway is right where the water stops. Pretty nifty, huh? Totally lost my place there. Here's the problem. You've got 75, 80 million people along in here. Basically, here's Washington, D.C. is about here. Boston's about here. It's one continuous city between Boston and Washington, D.C. It's basically one city of maybe 50 million people. And then between here and here, you've got maybe 75 million people. many millions of which will figure out what's happening in time to get in their cars and take off to wherever they think might be safe, which is probably going to be the Appalachian Mountains. That's the problem with the Appalachian Mountains. In Europe, you've got similar situations. Most of France will be underwater, parts of Germany, and so forth. Millions of people, they'll figure out this water's coming, and they want to go someplace safe. Well, the Swiss Alps, Bavaria, so forth. If they have time, they're going to go there. You can count on it. One of the things I write about in my paper, No Need for Panic, there we go, is the government's plural, not just the American government, but all these governments. As we get close to the event, there's going to be something happen. Maybe Ebola, maybe terrorist attacks, maybe a combination economic collapse. Whatever the event or events are, it will be so severe that when the government tells people to stay at home to be safe, almost all of them will stay at home to be safe, because that will appear to be the right thing to do, the proper thing to do, to be safe, to stay home, as opposed to going to Bavaria or the Swiss Alps or any high point. By the time they do figure out that they need to go to those places, it'll be too late. The government's job, in their opinion, is to protect themselves, with the exceptions, of course, of what the Chinese are doing for their chosen people, what Russians are doing with their chosen people. And once again, that's kept from the public. Most people in China don't know about these brand new cities. If they do, they don't think anything about it. Most people in Russia don't know about the underground cities in the Ural Mountains. When the time comes, the designated people will be moved to the new cities in China, to the underground cities in the Ural Mountains. What will England do? Well, they got some, I don't know if I'd call them mountains, they got them hills, and they're already moving critical infrastructure, critical government offices to the Highlands of Scotland. That's already happening. The royal family will probably take off for the Rocky Mountains in Canada, I imagine, someplace they think is safe. All these things are happening behind the scenes, without public knowledge, without public discourse, and we'll continue to do that. Our outreach here with video on YouTube, it's going to save a lot of lives. A lot of people will watch this and say, that's a bunch of silliness. Let's go watch a football game. Others will watch it and they will move forward and do their own homework and do their own research and come to their own independent conclusions, separate and apart from what John Moore says. Don't take my word for it. Do your own homework. Come to your own conclusions. Read, read, read. In the States, and I know Europe doesn't have the same problem we do, most adults under age 50 in the United States, for them, reading is not fun. Reading is not pleasurable. If they do it at all, it's because they have no choice. That's most adults in the United States under age 50. And it's a consequence of public education and what they've done to us. By design, by the way. By design. But for those who can read and will read, there's a lot to know. The bibliography at the end of my DVD, you're going to read 20,000 pages or more. If you really want to comprehend this, if you really want to understand it, what's happening, how it's going to happen, why it's going to happen, you need to read a lot. If you just watch my 4-hour DVD, you'll learn enough to get you started, hopefully. I've had entire families sit down and watch these 4 hours without saying a word. I get emails and phone calls all the time from people who began this quest, began by watching my DVD and going on to do the research, come to their conclusions, and then make their decision. Don't get caught up in a timetable. There's people who've given out timetables. I'm not going to mention any names here. But during most of the calendar year 2012, we had several people, very prominent people in the alternative media, talking about the 21st day of December 2012 being the day. Myself and my friend Professor McCanny spent much of that year telling people that December 21st was only the day before December 22nd and nothing else. Nothing else. We had people advising Americans by the thousands to go to a state park in Missouri where there were 3 primitive campgrounds. Now, primitive campground means no running water, no electricity, no toilet. Thousands of people were being told to go to this campground in a Missouri State Park. How crazy is that? By the 3rd day, that would have been a stinking, unhealthy mess if they had done it. Thank goodness they didn't. This afternoon, I'll be talking about preparedness. And where are we at on time? We got about 10 minutes. The breakdown of how people look at it between men and women is something I've been observing for a number of years. I did my first paid consultation in the summer of 1977, 40 years ago this month. And it's very predictable the way most women look at preparedness most of the time and the way most men look at preparedness most of the time. And the two really do complement each other. They really do. Frequently, I'll have a married couple where either the man or the woman believe that getting ready for NIBIRU is real and needs to happen, and the spouse thinks it's a waste of time and money. That happens a lot, and it's difficult to work with. I found out many years ago that the spouse who doesn't want to hear about it may become more agreeable if it's put into the terms of insurance. Now, in Western society, we have health insurance, automobile insurance, home insurance, life insurance, and others, all of which you may write a check every month, and at the end of the year, you got a stack of canceled checks to show for your efforts. When it comes to preparedness, you don't have a stack of canceled checks. You got 3-dimensional objects. You've got tools. You've got food. You've got training. They can't take your training away from you. All of which might be quite useful in the future. Food you can always eat. Training, you may need that. Tools, you could use the tools. If nothing else, you can always sell them in the future. Try selling your canceled checks from your car insurance. See how far that goes. So that helps with some of these couples that are having this discourse and this disagreement between the husband and wife. It sometimes helps, it doesn't always. When you've been doing this as long as I have, there's not much new that comes at me. Occasionally it does, but not frequently. I was working with a gentleman about a month ago. All this information he just found out about 5 or 6 months ago. And he just feels absolutely overwhelmed. He says, John, it's just too much. I don't have time. I can't do everything that can be done. I said, that's okay. You do what you can do. Don't worry about what you can't do. You take joy in what you can do. We all have limitations. A 20-year-old soldier has physical limitations. An 80-year-old grandmother has physical limitations. They're different. A 20-year-old soldier can carry a 100-pound backpack all day long. The 80-year-old grandmother may carry 2 liters of water all day long. They both got limitations. Everybody's got financial limitations, some greater than others. We'll talk about this more a little bit later. And the most important thing about preparedness, which is your spiritual preparedness. One of my consultation clients, he owns a business he inherited from his father with 100 employees. That's quite a payroll to meet every week, which he does. He has the financial ability to buy semi-tractor trailer loads of food and supplies and tools, pretty much anything he wants, which he has done. But it's never enough because his spiritual house is not in order. It will never be enough. And no matter what he gets, it will never be enough because the spiritual house is not in order. Most important thing you can do for yourself, quite frankly. And move on from there. One of the things I'll be talking about this afternoon is skills. I'll give you a little bit of a teaser here. Whether you have a group of 6 people or 600, there's 2 skills that will be in the biggest demand and the shortest supply. The first is ham radio skills. Now, I was laying on my belly during the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in 1968. We would do anything to get our hands on good, current, reliable information, which was in very short supply. If you're in a crisis and you don't know what's going on, most people, most of the time, their brain will go to the worst possible scenario immediately. Ham radio skills and the equipment that go with it will let you communicate with the world, let you know what's going on. The other skill is emergency first aid, emergency medical skills. Once again, in the biggest demand and shortest supply, whether you've got 6 people or 600. You need the training, you need the equipment and supplies to go with it. If you got the training and don't have the equipment and supplies, what's the point? You're going to be very limited. One of the things we'll be doing this afternoon is questions and answers. I'm a radio talk show host. I love when people call in because they'll bring up things that if they didn't, I wouldn't think about them. So when you come back this afternoon, I want you to bring your questions with you. And you doubting Thomases, I want to hear them. If you've ever been to political events where there's an elected official speaking and they're taking questions, these days, the questions have to be written and handed in. These politicians do not want spontaneous questions from the audience. They're scared to death of that. I'm not. Bring it on. I want these spontaneous, unrehearsed questions. I really look forward to them. Once you've looked at NIBIRU, Planet X, Wormwood, once you come and understand it, you can get carried away with the overwhelming knowledge that you've acquired, with the knowledge that the world that you know will cease to exist. As one man said, federal government employee, he says, "John, I'm too old to learn how to live all over again." But that's where we're going to be. We'll be living the lifestyle of our grandparents, our great-grandparents, an agrarian lifestyle, growing our own food, not going any farther than we can walk in half a day because you want to get back at the end of the day. I know in the States, when they were setting up our states and counties, they set up enough counties that the county seat would be half a day horse ride from the farthest location in the county. So a man could ride his horse to the county seat, conduct business, and get back before dark Before the 1930s in the States, government was at the county level. Very little involvement with the state government, almost no involvement at all with the federal government before the Great Depression in the 1930s. We're going to go back to that in the States, in Europe, in Asia. Government will be, if it exists at all, government will be at the local level. Now, there'll be a federal government that thinks they're in charge, but they won't be. They won't have the communications. They won't have the ability to go out and do much at all. There's other possibilities involving geopolitics, what the Russians may want to do, what the Chinese may want to do. That's another whole area that could be another whole lecture, which I'm qualified to talk about, but we're not here to talk about that. Now, your emphasis has to be on your family, on your community. One of the things I warn people about is what I call the island concept of preparedness. My family and I, we're going to get our 40 acres, 80 acres, put a fence around it, and it's us against the world. That's a disaster waiting to happen, is all that is. That's all that is. You need to be part of a community of like-minded people, as we say. And after the event, there's going to be a lot of like-minded people. They will figure out real quick that they need to come together as a community. The community I live in, Crawford County, Missouri, we have a local preparedness group. We have monthly training, things like first aid, communications, map and compass reading, CPR. We have a movie every Friday night, which is a social event. Get together and get to know each other. Have fun. Have some hot popcorn. It's all part of building a community. Do not think that you and your family can hold off the world. That's a disaster waiting to happen. If you think you can do that, you're wrong. You're absolutely wrong. You need to be part of a community that will come together as a community to survive together. All right, we're back here in Prague on July 22nd, 2017. We're going to talk about the effects of the NIBIRU Flyby, Planet X, Wormwood, the destroyer, and how to prepare for it. First, the effects. There will be iron oxide covering all the waters of the planet, fresh water and salt water both. That will take days to dissipate. I don't know how many days, but days, possibly weeks to dissipate. We could have winds when the jet stream comes to the surface of the planet. In fact, this happened here in the Czech Republic, what was that, about 10 years ago? When that forest got wiped out, those straight line winds. Anybody remember that? Come on, some of you do. Straight line winds, maybe 100, 150 miles an hour for a better part of a day. Rocks the size of automobiles and trucks, rocks the size of this auditorium. We don't know when they're going to hit or where, but that's happened before. Meteors, rocks, and I got a pointer, all right. Earthquakes. I'll tell you what the U.S. Navy said. I got this pointer, I might as well make use of it. New Madrid, Missouri is about right there. The most dangerous seismic zone on the planet. During the winter of 1811, 1812, there were hundreds of earthquakes. 3 of them made church bells ring in Philadelphia, right up here. That's about 700, 800 miles. Now, the energy from that seismic zone goes north and south and east very efficiently, does not go west into the Ozarks, because right here, there's a ridge of granite that acts as a blocking mechanism, as a shock absorber to absorb that energy. The U.S. Navy says that when this water, this inland sea is formed, the weight of the water will trigger 3 9-point plus earthquakes. which would wipe out St. Louis, Chicago, Memphis, points east. A lot of devastation. There's going to be earthquakes all over the planet. I just happen to know about that seismic zone in North America. Volcanoes are going to kick off. Lots of volcanoes all over the planet. We may end up with 1 or 2 years with no summer, which would wipe out the growing season, of course. When these oceans come up, all the ports, most of the goods on this planet, automobiles, trucks, raw materials, petroleum, food, is moved by ship, by large cargo ships. No ports, there's no way to load and unload the ships, probably for years. What I tell my listeners on my radio show is the best thing you can do is to become part of a farm. We have an expression in the States we call a hobby farm. That's a farm where the fruits, vegetables, produce, milk, meat, whatever it might be, is meant for consumption on the premises, not to be sold to make a living. Obviously, if you have extra eggs, you sell your extra eggs, but primarily for consumption by the people on the farm. I recommend people have a 2-year supply of food. We can easily, if you're just starting out, by the way, learning how to garden, the first garden you plant is probably going to be a disaster. You can almost count on that. The second garden you plant, you may get enough food to get you by maybe for a season. By the 3rd or 4th year of gardening, you're learning how to actually raise enough food successfully to get by for a full year. It's an ongoing process. I'm not a gardener, but the gardeners I know, whether they've been gardening for 5 years or 20 or 50 years, they're still learning. It's an ongoing learning process being a gardener. You don't want to be within 100 miles of a major city, which would be basically 200 kilometers. You really don't. There's going to be hungry, desperate people looking to feed their children. Now, movies and novels focus a lot on healthy young males going about and causing problems after a disaster like this, which of course there'd be a lot of that. But I'll tell you, ladies and gentlemen, a 25-year-old mother with a hungry 1-year-old is going to be just as dangerous as a gang member. She will do whatever it takes to get food for her child. That's just human nature. People will do whatever it takes to feed their children. The farther away you are from a major city, the better off you'll be. That's pretty much a given. I mentioned earlier today the skills a person may want. Let's talk about emergency medical treatment skills. You've got first aid, CPR, that's cardiopulmonary resuscitation. You've got advanced first aid. Now in the States we have what we call emergency medical technicians, which is entry level. In the States it's 1 semester of college to become an emergency medical technician, EMT. 3 more semesters of college and you become what's called a paramedic, which is typically the highest level of training that you find on an ambulance in the States. Getting that training now while you can would be a really good thing. We have what appears to be the luxury of time. That might be a complete illusion. But we have what appears to be the luxury of time to learn CPR, to learn emergency medical treatment, and get the equipment and the supplies you need. Now, if you attempt to use medical equipment you're not qualified to use, you could hurt somebody or even kill them. Pretty serious stuff. So when you get your training, get medical equipment equal to your level of training. If you get more than you can use, more than you're qualified to use, it could be quite dangerous. And get lots of it. When these ports are closed, and it'll be on both sides of the Atlantic, when all these ports are underwater, there's not going to be spare parts anymore. That's not going to happen. The chance of the power grid surviving nationwide in the States or in many of these other countries is pretty minimal. And of course, I should mention there's other threats above and beyond, or in addition to, a NIBIRU flyby. One of the main ones, of course, being the consequences of a coronal mass ejection, which the worst one we're aware of happened in 1859, or a man-made EMP, electromagnetic pulse. The coronal mass ejection, quite frankly, could be far worse than a man-made electromagnetic pulse for the following reason. Electromagnetic pulse is strictly line of sight. It can't go around the surface of the planet, around the curvature of the Earth. Coronal mass ejection, if it's powerful enough, can go all the way around the planet, knocking out the power grid worldwide. In some ways, a nationwide or EMP to hit Europe or the United States or South America could in some ways be worse than the NIBIRU flyby. The estimates for the states, for the United States, is 9 out of 10 Americans would be dead in 1 year if we had a nationwide power outage. Think about it. Now, I don't know the numbers for Europe, but in the United States, 8% of the adults in the United States are diabetic. You've got another percentage of people who need heart medication, other people who need medication that keeps them from rejecting organ transplants. All kinds of life-saving medication that after electromagnetic pulse would be gone. The typical prescription is 30 days, which means the typical person has 15 days of their pharmaceutical products. Once they're gone, they're gone. I do recommend that people find alternatives to the pharmaceutical products. It may be herbs. It may be essential oils. It may be different things for different people. Maybe just stop taking them. Sometimes you're taking things you really don't need. But finding a way to have an alternative now, if you say you're taking 5 or 6 prescription items, if you go off those all at the same time, you're going to be hurting real bad. But if you incrementally get off them one at a time and substitute herbs or vitamins or essential oils, it'd be a lot more pleasant experience than trying to do it all at once. I mentioned earlier ham radio. Ham radio was first developed by these different governments to give people a way to communicate in the event of a crisis. Most people involved in ham radio, it doesn't matter what country it is, almost all of them have an interest in preparedness. One of the things I'm always being asked when I come to presentations like this, John, how can I find people of like mind, as we say, who know what I know, who believe what I know? In ham radio, you're going to find people like that. It doesn't matter whether it's Prague or London or Warsaw or New York City. People involved in ham radio, almost all of them are interested in being prepared. That's pretty much ubiquitous around the planet. It doesn't matter whether you're an 8-year-old boy or girl or an 80-year-old man or woman, you can be involved in ham radio and enjoy the hobby and have fun with it. Meet interesting people, learn how to do things you would never do otherwise. I mentioned earlier the difference between the way women approach preparedness and the way men approach preparedness. It's very predictable. The women tend to focus on the practical things. How in the world am I going to do laundry? How am I going to feed the kids? How am I going to cook? How am I going to keep the place clean? Men tend to focus on things like, how do I keep my car or truck running? How am I going to keep the water functioning? The things that men typically take care of anyway. But the two come together to make a whole. Learning what you need to do now, having the tools you need to do it now. Let's talk, for example, how do you do laundry? It wasn't so long ago when our grandparents, our great-grandparents, 1 full day a week to do nothing but laundry, right? 1 full day a week to do nothing but laundry for the family. Guess what? That's coming back, unfortunately. Now, in the States, up until the 1970s, we had wringer washers. There's no place to hook up hot and cold running water under 40 pounds pressure. There's no place for it. You simply put water in it, you turn on the agitator, it agitates till you turn it off, pour out the water, put in fresh water, agitate it till it's rinsed out, and so forth. Maytag used to be the really big manufacturer of these wringer washers. They can be reconfigured to work with a bicycle. There's lots of ways to get a wringer washer to work. They're very simple devices. And it's a lot easier to get a little bit of electricity than it is to get hot and cold running water under 40 pounds pressure. A lot easier. You'll get electricity before you'll get hot and cold running water under 40 pounds pressure. One of the things I learned in the Army was you're in civilization when you can take a hot shower. That's quite extraordinary in case you don't know it, being able to take a hot shower. And if you can do that, you're in really good shape. How do you prepare your food when there's no electricity, no natural gas? How do you clean your utensils? What do you do for toilet paper? Lots of questions there. What are the answers? The more you adopt that lifestyle now, the less of a shock it's going to be. Now, out where I live in the Ozarks, there's two families competing who can be the most redneck. So one family, the 12-year-old daughter, killed a poisonous copperhead snake, and the parents cooked it and they ate it about 3 weeks ago, much to the shock of many of their neighbors. And so now the competition goes on to harvest and prepare and eat different critters that we find in our area. We got possums, we got raccoons, we got squirrels, deer, of course. Deer is a real big thing. But those skills that now are looked at as recreation, in the future would be a matter of life and death. To be able to hunt, to be able to fish. Gardening. Most people, for right now, gardening is a hobby. Gardening is a recreational pastime. It won't be in the future. It'll be something that would be a matter of life and death. Most people live in or near a major metropolitan area. That's the nature of our world, here in the first world anyway, in Europe and in the United States. And they live in and near these metropolitan areas because of employment. That's where the jobs are. I understand that. You drive 100 miles away from the city, you've got farmland. How do you become part of an ongoing farm? Well, you either buy a place or you become part of that farm. Farmers need two things. They need money and they need manpower for labor. Almost all farms, almost all the time. Especially small farms, hobby farms, family farms. Perhaps you can find a family farm that would be glad to have extra labor on weekends. Be glad to have a little extra capital to buy an implement, a tool that they don't have now that they could really make great use of. Whatever it takes to become a part of a farm, preferably at a good elevation, has plenty of water, preferably a place where the winters aren't too bad. The higher elevation you go, the worse the winters get in general. And become part of it. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. Finding a place like that and becoming part of it, it's going to be time-consuming. It's going to be difficult. You're going to be disappointed a lot until you find just the right place where you would be welcome. Most of you listening, wherever you might be, you're looking for a date. The only people looking for a date for the NIBIRU Flyby, the only people, are the ones who aren't living a day-to-day life of preparedness. Because once you are, a date becomes irrelevant. It no longer matters. The Navy veterans weren't given a date. They were told, gentlemen, you start a new life, you set up your hobby farm, you start your new career, and you just live your life. They don't think about a date. They don't worry about a date. It's not an issue. And I find this to be true pretty much all the time. That the men and women searching for a date, John, when's it going to happen? I know instantly that they're not prepared, that they're not living a life of preparedness. I know that instantly. There's almost no exceptions. Almost none. It's a harsh reality, knowing that our world, as we know it, could come to a crashing end. In 2012, there was a coronal mass ejection that almost hit Earth. Not quite, thank goodness. Now, the one that hit in 1859, it hit North America. We didn't have a nationwide power grid, obviously, but we did have, from the Mississippi east, where's this thing? From the Mississippi east, we had a telegraph system. And the telegraphs went all over, east, west, north, south. Those telegraph wires picked up, they acted as antennas to pick up that energy from the sun and direct it into the telegraph offices where they set fires. The barbed wire fences in the farmers' fields picked up that energy and set the fields on fire. The scientists say that when, it's not a matter of if, when another one that size happens to hit Earth, it will knock out the power grid and the entire, half the planet at least, maybe the whole planet. One of the things you find out when you look into these power grids, whether it's Europe, South America, and North America, it doesn't matter. There's these massive multi-million-dollar transformers that make everything work. In the United States, there's about 19 of them. They're so big and so expensive and so reliable that they don't have backups. If they do need to buy a new one, right now, in 2017, from the moment they place the order until the time they take delivery, with everything working normally, is 1 year. When everything's broken, that's over. It's not going to be any delivery. It's not going to happen. I'm sure Europe's in the same situation with these massive, expensive transformers that control and make everything work. This planet has been through these cycles multiple times. We've been smashed down to the mud and recovered as human beings multiple times. This will be no exception. Who's going to survive? Young men and women, healthy young men and women who are on farms, are diligent and smart and have resources. They'll be the ones that will survive. Older folks, well, many of us will survive also if we're healthy and work hard and are diligent. But most people won't. 9 out of 10 people on this planet will die if there's a worldwide coronal mass ejection event. Very harsh reality. I want to open this up to questions. It's one of my favorite parts, and I told Alexander I would be up here half an hour, and we're coming up not too far from that. So questions from the audience, please. Are you scratching your head, or do you have a question? Alexandra? You want to do questions later when we have the panel? That's fine. That's fine. No problem. Which other countries?
For example, Sweden.
Well, the farther north you are, the less problems you're going to have with the ocean, on one hand. Now, here's something I didn't mention now. The North Pole would be up here, above this, that's Canada. North Pole would be way up here. There's two North Poles. True North, which is where the axis of the planet is, and magnetic north. This has happened many times, and the scientists have figured this out. Magnetic north right now is moving towards Siberia. Magnetic north is in Siberia. For about 36 centuries, magnetic north moves in a certain direction, and then over a period of maybe 3 days to a week, true north catches up with it. That's the pole shift. That's the pole shift. And it's quite an event. Most of us will live to see at least most of it, maybe all of it. That's when these oceans come out of their basins, flooding these areas. Now, there's going to be two parts to the flooding. There's going to be the slosh, which could be 200 meters, and there's going to be the new ocean levels, which won't be that high, depending on where you are. I didn't mention where all the water is going to come from. This is pretty important. Now, here's South Texas, you got Mexico. You got the equator down about here. Sea level is measured at Cornwall, England. It's been that way for more than 200 years. They took a big rock at the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. They made a horizontal line. They said, this is sea level. When you get to the equator, the ocean is not quite 500 feet, about 490 feet above that horizontal line in Cornwall, England. Most of us, when we were kids, we would take a bucket of water, a full bucket, and swing it over our heads real fast, and the water doesn't come out, right? You did that. Well, that water at the equator is held in place by two things, the rotation of the Earth and gravity. Anything that disrupts the rotation of the Earth is going to disrupt that bulge of water. That bulge of water at the equator is tens of thousands of cubic miles of water. That's where the water is going to come from. It's all going to be displaced. When that happens, well, everything changes.
And John, the new equator, how do you think it will look like?
The equator?
The equator, you suppose that it will be altered, isn't it?
Well, there'll be a new equater.
Yeah, and
the old equator will be gone, and it'll be a new equator.
Yeah, and could you tell us here in Czech Republic, for example?
Well, we need to look at a globe. You may be far enough away from Siberia and Russia that you'll have a warmer climate here, I hope. It's going to be a 45-degree pole shift. I'm pretty certain of that. Without having a globe and looking at it, it's difficult to tell exactly where Czech's going to end up. I hope you end up in a warmer climate. That would be a good thing. And you may be far enough west that would be the case. I hope so. We don't have any control over it, obviously. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And there's going to be mass migrations. If you end up in an area where you have winter 6 or 8 months a year, you're probably going to want to get away from it and go south. That's the most likely scenario.
Could you say something, how you expect the dust will be and the stones?
How the what would be?
Dust.
The iron oxide?
Yeah.
Well, it's mentioned in the Bible when Moses was leaving Egypt, how the water turned red. That was iron oxide. And Dr. Velikowski, as I mentioned earlier, he demonstrated by the ancient records that happened all over the planet at the same time. You won't be able to drink that water. It'll make you real sick. And you'll have to have a source of water coming from underground, obviously, or a way to purify it if it's a surface water. Water's going to be a big thing real quick, by the way. Having access to pure drinking water is not optional. It's probably the largest reason right now, in July 2017, for infants dying on the planet is bad drinking water. It'll become even more so. Us people in the first world country, we're used to having easy access to pure drinking water. That won't be the case anymore. It will no longer be easy. There's an old saying around the prepper community, 1 is none, 2 is 1. Anything critical, like a water filter, get 2 of them. Anything critical, like a radio, get 2 of them. That's just a smart thing to do.
How do you think it will it be difficult to breathe? The dust should be covered.
You don't want to be breathing in iron oxide. You just stay indoors. If you have to go out, put some kind of filter or mask on. It wouldn't take much. A T-shirt would filter out enough that you'd be okay. If you stay out of it for 24 hours, you're probably going to be okay.
And stones.
The stones, well, they're going to hit. In fact, you may want to make a note of this. One of the largest meteor craters on the planet is about 10 miles from where I live. Crooked Creek Meteor Crater. Crooked Creek Meteor Crater. It's 3 miles across. It's massive. It's so big they didn't even know it was a meteor crater until they had aircraft that could fly over and say, oh, look at that. That's not normal. From the ground, you can't tell it's a meteor crater. But they're going to these rocks are going to hit all over the planet. We don't know where. If you're unlucky enough to be hit by one, you won't have to worry about it. It's going to kill you. But most people won't be hit by rocks. They will hit. They will do damage. And having some sort of underground shelter would just be a smart thing because we're looking at 150-mile-an-hour winds for at least a day. Possibly torrential downpours of rain. The rocks, like we said. The iron oxide. Having underground shelter would be a real smart thing if you can do it.
In the Bible and other scriptures, you can read about the 3 days of darkness, and that we should cover for our eyes so that our eyes could be damaged if we look outside.
Well, I think you're talking about the kill shot. And we may be looking at 150 degree Fahrenheit temperatures for a better part of a day, which for a healthy adult, you know, if they got water, they're going to be okay. Children under age 5 and older people would probably die in that much heat for 10 or 12 hours. That's one of the possibilities. It is, absolutely. And protecting your eyes from the sun would be a smart thing also. There'll be things happen that you would never believe would happen during these events. Things, as we say, of biblical proportions. People will be desperate. Men, you know, healthy men, typically not afraid of anything, would be falling on their knees and crying. That's how bad it will be.
And how do you prepare mentally or?
Well, this is maybe how I should end up this part of this, and that's spiritual preparedness. I address this on my radio show occasionally. I tell people the following. It's not my job as a radio talk show host to tell you what your spiritual belief should be, on one hand. On the other, I do feel a responsibility to let you know that that part of your life needs to be addressed, whatever it is for you, whatever it is. We know from the interviews and books of people who survived POW camps and concentration camps in World War II, the men and women who went into those camps with a strong spiritual foundation were far more likely to survive than the ones that didn't. The ones that didn't have a strong spiritual foundation, they're the ones that curled up into a ball and died and did not survive. So work on that. Begin that quest. It can and should become a lifelong quest, your spiritual preparedness. Finding peace with your Maker. Finding peace with your Creator. Whatever your verbiage is, it doesn't matter. What does matter is that you begin that quest. I've only been to one funeral for an atheist, and it was run by atheists, and it was the saddest thing I've ever been to. Very sad. And the atheists in control would not permit any mention of God, any prayers. They simply did not let it happen. It was a very sad event. I felt very sorry for the family of this gentleman. He was a friend of mine. So work on that. It may be Christianity, it may be Buddhism, it may be Native American spiritual beliefs, whatever it is. My friend Tim Spencer is a Native American, and he says quite frankly, John, I'm not a Christian. We have our own beliefs. And I said, Tim, I respect that. And they do. And whatever your beliefs might be, you folks listening and watching this DVD, this movie, maybe you've walked away from that for whatever reason. The beliefs you were born into as a family, in your family. The beliefs that you may have had at some point in your life you no longer do. The beliefs that you don't take seriously. Maybe only on Sunday you think about them. Go back to your roots, whatever that is for you. It might be Judaism, it might be Christianity, it might be Buddhism, Native American, doesn't matter. Get involved in your spiritual life once again, incorporate it, and make it something you do every day. That's how to get through this. That's the single most important thing I can tell anybody, is to get your spiritual house in order. And I think we may be done.